Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and folks, I'm delighted to be rejoined by someone who I've actually had great time for over a number of years, but I haven't spoken to since he jumped ship to another organisation whereby, I'll be honest, a lot of it just disappeared behind the paywall. But it's not someone that I haven't have been in contact throughout the time. But he's written a really interesting piece, and we will get to that. And I want to frame it correctly, and I want to frame it, unfortunately for you listeners, via the prism of my own experience of what happened on October 7th. And this is going to be a little bit of indulge me here, please, because it's a horrible place, condemnable, utterly condemned. But I, at the time, was not in my own home. I was with relatives in cramped accommodation because we were staying in with other people, and I was on one of these bloody inflatable mattresses that wouldn't stay up, right? So I'd say I'd had 3.5 hours sleep, and I had WhatsApp messages from young Gazan Palestinian journalist Mahmoud Mustafa telling me what was going on. And my immediate response was, and I swear to this day it's on my phone, oh shit, thousands are going to die. And Mahmoud came back and he said, can you record with me? And needless to say, I managed to throw people out of a tiny little room in my relatives, and we recorded the first podcast as the operation, as it was called at the time, was taking place. And then something else happened. All of the journalists that I know in Gaza, and I know quite a few, began to reach out to me and said that they would like to speak to Western powers because they knew what was going to happen and they knew about getting their voices out there. And could I put them in touch with other people? And for the next number of weeks and months, I spent a lot of time putting journalists from on the ground in Gaza in touch with producers, editors, columnists, you name it, all across the Irish spectrum, from RTE to INM to even people who I don't like in Bauer Media. And I'm very plain about my own beliefs on this. And actually, the Journal took us up on one person who they allowed to report anonymously, which was really helpful, I'll be honest with you. But there wasn't the take up that I wanted to see. There really wasn't. And I've lost friends because of this. I've lost connections because of this, because I was so upset with some of the producers that were involved in certain outlets that they wouldn't center Palestinian journalists' voices in things. And journalism was going to be so important in what was going to happen, because it was clear this was not going to be a normal escalation. This was going to be something tragic, and I didn't think at the time genocidal, but this is where we are now, 557 days into this horrendous stain on humanity. And as I said, we've repeatedly seen journalism fail itself, and journalists in Gaza be failed by Western journalists, and not enough people have spoken out. And that is why I was absolutely thrilled in a difficult way, Niall, I'll be honest with you, when you wrote the piece, omissions, caveats and false balance, how media is failing Palestinians, the international order and our profession. And I'm delighted to say I'm going to be rejoined on the podcast by the current affairs correspondent, Niall Sargent with The Currency, who wrote this piece. Niall, thank you for joining me, and thank you for writing it. And I want to begin with the biggest question that I should ask you immediately. Why did you want to write the piece?
Yeah, thanks as always, Tony, for having me. And well, before I say that, I think testament to you guys for the work that you've been doing in and around Palestine, not just since October 2023, but before that as well. And I think you guys have been doing some of the best, the most in-depth reporting, and actually getting in touch with those reporters, our eyes and ears in Gaza for the last 18 months. I think it's incredible work, and it just shows the fact that it had to be a small publication such as yourselves, who are leading the way, or the Ditch, or ourselves, all smaller publications, actually are the ones who've been doing the most in-depth reporting on this. That, I would probably say the larger media institutions should be doing here to that level, that scale, that scope. And that's probably one of the reasons why I did want to write this piece, and I think it's something I've wanted to write for quite a period of time now, not just because of how Irish media has been writing about what's happening in Gaza, but Western media, in general. It's obviously very disappointing in many ways in terms of how we're supposed to be striking a genuine balance in reporting. A false balance is obviously one of the issues I explored in the piece, sort of both sides as I'm looking at these things. So the caveats that get attached to reporting, all these things that are just on reflection as a journalist you look at, and when you actually see the reporting from Gaza, when you look at your social media and you see the reporters there, what's being fed back to you, the reality on the ground, and then you look at an article, say in a publication in Ireland and also abroad in the US, obviously New York Times, Washington Post, others, the way it's reflected, it's not the reality of what's happening. It doesn't reflect what I'm seeing or you're seeing day in and day out on social media directly from the ground. So, I don't see why we're reporting in the way it has been reported. I suppose the thing that really stood out to me is that there's a great quote from Jonathan Foster, former journalist. I guess you're always a journalist, but an academic in Sheffield University. I think a lot of people noticed when he said, if someone says it's raining outside and another says it's dry, it's not your job to quote the two of them. It's your job to look at the effing window and find out which is true of the two. And I just feel reporters in Western media in particular haven't been doing this. And when it's your own profession, you have to start talking about these things, because if as journalists, if there's an omerta in other areas of work, like in FIFA, we've seen at other places where people keep stum, don't speak up about things. Journalists then will sense blood and go after stories like that and ask people, why didn't you speak out, why didn't you say something? Whereas when it comes to ourselves, it's almost like you're not supposed to say anything. But I guess for me, it just probably reached a point. And when Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, came here, and I was at the press conference, and I was one of the journalists that she was not being too kind with in her words.
Chastising, shall we say. Chastising.
Yeah. Chastising, as she rightly has been doing, because obviously she had just come out of RT's studio where, the interview framing followed probably what she wasn't expecting to get in Ireland, but the same as she's received in many other Western countries. She was frustrated, and I think that was kind of, for me, that was reflected back to me through her. I was like, this is something that probably needs to be highlighted in a bit more detail, that only a few have been doing. Colin Sheridan in The Examiner, for example, has done some wonderful reporting for them, yourselves, The Ditch, but there's not enough of us, I suppose, exploring it in the depth and the accuracy that it requires, because can we go to the piece? And I'm going to jump right to probably about 3/4 of the way through the piece, where you mention the treatment of Francesca Albanese, and I'm using the word treatment, you don't need to, but in terms of the conversation she has, not with Gavin Jennings, and as she had on Morning Ireland, but later with Fran McNulty on Primetime in the pre-recorded interview that she did. And he talks about the idea of the two sides situation. Now, as you said, nearly 18 months into this, 18 months where we've seen at least 50,000 are dead in Gaza. We've seen the Lancet reports putting it multiple of that, of what's actually befallen the people of Gaza. But he also then touched when I was there, and I think, and I hope you, I think you were so succinct and so good in how you expressed it, about how you said, well, he wasn't there. In what your reporting shows, he was in Tel Aviv. He was, and I recall personally watching him on TV at one time. This was available. He was in Tel Aviv. He was wearing a flak jacket with the press logo on it, and he was reporting for RTE, and behind him were cyclists with Deliveroo bags going by, because everything was just normal, and nothing said to me
You know, you're not really there, like that image to me. And I think, as being as so invested in it as I am, and hold my hand up and say, absolutely I am, I think you made that point very well by saying, why are we two sides in this still?
Yeah, I just think that's kind of a key problem, is the framing. I suppose the framing of the war framing or war narrative is the one that I explore. That there's, yeah, like, because when you put something in the context of war, I think for someone who isn't aware of the intricacies of what's happening, isn't close to it, isn't necessarily following it, which you're going to get on an RTE audience or a sort of nighttime publication or nighttime show, something like that. People are going to tune in who mightn't know the ins and outs. I think when you frame something as a war, you give an impression that there are two equal or even sides at war, two state sides. That's a traditional way of thinking, rather than the reality on the ground, which is, and this is obviously very clear from the UN over decades now, that it's an occupation and an occupied peoples. So it's a very different scenario when you get the full context of what is happening and has been happening in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem for decades. So I think that's the key issue when it is framed in such a way. And I think when you have an expert challenging you on that and explaining the situation to you as a reporter, that's something you need to probably take into account more. And I think it was very telling, the different tenor that was taken on primetime just the following week, when you had the Irish doctor in the studio, Morgan McGonigal. He was in the studio,
and I want to come to that part as well.
And they did but they did a fantastic job on that. I think the report, like the piecing together the imagery that he had, and also from Gaza, which has obviously been fed back by journalists who are putting their lives on the line every day to report from within Gaza. And they gave him the time to explain the situation, what's happening on the ground from a medical perspective, the decimation of the medical infrastructure and targeting, as we know, of doctors, frontline responders, as well as the terrible case from a few weeks ago highlighted. But he's given the air, but I think it shouldn't take that sort of an Irish face to take the facts at face value.
Niall, I need to push in.
It's those sort of issues. And
I need to push in. I'm sorry, because you've absolutely nailed one of the things that has been so disappointing to me over those nearly 18 months. We've interviewed medics on the ground from Gaza. We've, if the interview we did with Dr. Khalid, who had been taken from Nasser Hospital, tortured for 7 months, and then dumped back into Gaza and went back to work, folks. I got in touch with other outlets in Ireland and said, I can help you talk to this guy. And I'm going to say it. There's an Orientalist lens that they look through things. And, that's not to take away from Morgan McGonigal and the work that he's done, but there is an Orientalist lens that things are looked through, because the success of what Israel did by holding, in this case, Dr. Khalid for 7 months, was to make him sound like, even though he's never charged with anything, never did anything wrong, it makes him feel like, oh, can we really platform him? And no one within Irish national media was brave enough to even listen to his voice. And that comes across when in that little paragraph when you talk about the Morgan McGonigal piece. And that's something that, really pisses me off. I have to be honest with you. It just pisses me off.
Yeah. No, I can understand the frustration with that. I think I would have it as well. And because like you said, I've listened to so many voices on the podcast, and hear that you've been, people you've been speaking to, journalists on the ground in Gaza, and you can see like some of those voices also now making their way into Dropsite News and other, very fantastic publications from the US and elsewhere, with seasoned reporters, Jeremy Scahill, others behind them. So these are real journalists. These are just as good journalists as us, and they're actually on the ground. Their voices should be heard.
We had one journalist who RTE turned down, and 36 hours later was on the front page of the LA Times. So so when you wrote what you wrote, you said that Gaza is a news graveyard, and we keep seeing hashtag journalism is not a crime. Go on.
Yeah, and just on that, I suppose I didn't that's Brown University Cost of War project. So that's an academic project who is saying that. So it just, like, they've done the research, they've shown, which I knew the scale, but I there's over, depends on, we shouldn't have to have different metrics, but you're talking at least around 170, let's say straight up, if you want to call them journalists, up to Al Jazeera's figures of over 222 from December, which is probably up to about almost 250 now when you take in really key people in media as well, like translators or drivers or fixers. But that Brown University report, like, when you put it all together, it's so stark that there's more reporters and media personnel killed in Gaza in 16 to 18 months than all those 2 world wars, Vietnam, ex-Yugoslavia, all of Balkans War, and Afghanistan combined. Like, it's crazy when you put that into that perspective. And that's, I suppose that's probably been the hardest thing for me. And maybe it was the, when Hussam Shabat was targeted and killed only a few weeks ago, 23-year-old Al Jazeera reporter, that was probably the hardest point of it for me, because I don't like when you see people online and you actually make a connection through that way. I'm not a big fan of, have people having those connections, because I think they sometimes connect with celebrities and other individuals who I don't think necessarily have a very good standpoint on things. But I probably got some of that with Hussam from the reporting he was doing on the front lines in the north of Gaza, and when he was put on, what, quote unquote, was a hit list of 6 Al Jazeera reporters by the Israeli Defense Forces last year. When he was put on that list with, zero evidence of association with militant groups, Reporters Without Borders said there's no proof in what the IDF were saying. You follow that, and then after the ceasefire, he sees his mother for the first time in 15 months, and within days he's putting on his press vest to go back out and into what he knew would probably be him targeted again. And that's what happened. And that one really hit me, because you're just seeing this reporter at the start of his career, and he's been putting himself on the front line as those other hundreds of reporters did for the last 15, 18 months, and that's all they've known. And for Western media not to make that an issue is the most, because at least as reporters, that's the one thing you can do publicly, I suppose. You obviously have to try to be as neutral as you can as reporters in general, but one thing you can certainly do is come out and say, my colleagues should not be killed for doing their job, and there are not enough reporters who are doing that. Even though we're seeing this unprecedented targeting of reporters, not just them being killed, targeting of them, which is just, if we don't speak out against that, we normalize it, and we normalize it for the next time. And maybe one day, if conflict came back to Ireland, if we normalize this now, someone like me could just be targeted.
I think it's actually even deeper than that on a level, because we've swallowed, as your research has shown, we've swallowed talking points and reported them and caveated them, and given these narratives that have been disproven. If you recall, think about how far we've come in 18 months. In 18 months, we've come from Israel would not bomb a hospital to, it was a misfired rocket from Hamas. It was, and then to, well, we bombed the hospital, but it was a Hamas base. To now, the last standing hospital is getting bombed, and Israel's going, we're doing this now, and hands up, and we're just doing it now because there's someone in there who is getting treatment, and this justifies the means. It's crazy. I know.
I think it's and just on that, it's just on that, it's kind of, it comes back to the other thing we talked about in the piece about the sort of caveats of the Hamas-run healthcare institution, or Hamas-run health ministry. I mean, it's the UN who have described the attacks on women in healthcare as genocidal acts from Israel. Another UN report, quote, concerted policy to destroy the healthcare system of Gaza. These are UN institutions who are saying this. And I think it's when you have headlines like when you had the bombing on what was remaining functional part of the hospital the other day, with the BBC I think it was highlighted a lot on social media, how the BBC changed their article because probably of pressure. The original article basically said the hospital's been bombed, Hamas health
It's it.
ministry says.
The headline says, according to Hamas, was the original headline.
Yeah. Whereas for me, there's so many images from journalists, from the UN, from others like that. That's all verified. I still don't quite understand. I know we have to, as journalists, you often have to obviously put in your sources of where the information is coming from, but that has become a sort of caveat to you need to take this information with a pinch of salt. There might not be, it might not be fully accurate, and it's just at this stage. I could understand maybe 18 months ago or so, but at this stage, we know their figures of the death toll is widely accepted by the UN institutions. And at the end of conflicts, there's been analysis done that the figures often tally, including the figures that Israel would officially use. They're very close. But again, if it's off in some way, shape or form by even a few thousand, the numbers are still far too high of civilians killed, and the number of babies, children under the age of 15, the teenagers killed. That's what we should be looking at, and the number of babies killed is just alone far too high. And I think you saw the UN said in the last, several dozen attacks since the ceasefire was broken, that I think in the majority of his cases the victims were just women and children. It's civilians. Can
I say you've raised the ceasefire? Another reason why media let us down and let people in Gaza down is by reporting on again both siding the end of the ceasefire as if it was something that just happened because both sides again were at it. And you pointed out in your reporting, well, you've omitted the 100 people who were killed during the period of the ceasefire, and I'm almost doing air quotes here, Niall. And to omit that is to actually. It's actually to not do your job. It's as simple as that. You are not doing your job.
Yeah, I think it's an issue of Irish publications taking wire copy as we call it, like from the likes of Reuters or AP and others, and I suppose just taking their copy and republishing it, whereas there's an opportunity obviously to examine that. And I think there was a piece in the Irish Times we highlighted that said that ceasefire had come to a conclusion. And that was copied from Reuters, that after 2 months of relative calm, which I found crazy. But just before that, I think another thing that sort of, when you said, why did you write this? Another one that piqued my interest was a piece in The Guardian, which, takes some of their reporting very, 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 very good on some of the issues, but some of their reporting I would say has been very poor in terms of the accuracy. I just found this one crazy. It was all in one sentence that I think that both sides had refrained from returning to war, but also in that same sentence said that Israel had conducted an intensifying series of airstrikes in Gaza that killed dozens during the ceasefire period. So as a reporter, I guess how you could write that sentence and not realize the issues in it, or an editor could look at that and not see that does not quite make sense. So then it brings you into the second questioning of how does a paragraph or a sentence like that get published? Why is that published? And those are the sort of quandaries I would have myself now in this profession, looking at the work of other colleagues, how you could write that, how an editor could let that over the line, and if they do, for what reason is it going across the line? And it just, having to question some of those things, it's not a position you ever want to be in as a journalist, or to start questioning colleagues in the profession. But it's the reality of on the ground is what we have to report.
Which brings me to the point of, I've used the word genocide here on this conversation that we've had. We've used it repeatedly, and one of the quotes you use is that it's it's easier to contend with a genocide in the past than deal with it in the present. And there is this, immediate reaction if anybody somehow manages to finagle their way onto a TV show or a radio show, and they use the G word, and they will be corrected, and despite, all of the evidence that you have, shown that is backed up from not just academics globally, but academics within Israel as well.
But I think it's also a thing, even if people want to avoid using terminology around genocide, I mean, there are Netanyahu is wanted at the ICC accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There's various UN reports who've pointed at this. There is a report from, very early on in the, I think it was in late 2023 or early 2024, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur in Palestine, said, her research was the belief that the threshold to show genocidal intent had been met. There's various. If we're, in terms of the Hamas leaders, rightfully as well wanted at the International Criminal Court for the attacks on October 7th, rightfully so. We're very, that can be talked about very openly, as can the ICC case when it comes up. But I mean, those things are a fact. Those are the accusations that are there. We can talk about those. So there has been a general reluctance, but I think there's so many UN reports that have come out now. There's so many reports from Human Rights Watch, others. Also, I suppose, taking the wider context, going back decades of reports, of understanding of the situation of the occupation of an apartheid regime. It should be a lot easier to have the terminology. I suppose reporters should already have this sort of terminology because there's so many official reports from the UN and elsewhere that have examined this in detail. So that's another difficulty, I suppose, in how it's been reported.
I think it's been kind of a lot of people, as you point out, when they tune in to say something like prime time, the simplest narrative sometimes is what the media will want to do because it's the easiest thing to do in the reporting, and that comes across in so many of the reporting that I've seen, not just before or not just after October 7th. I have to stress, we've been covering Gaza and Palestine and these issues since the outset of this podcast. We've made so many connections. We've that's how we were able to bring voices that weren't being platformed anywhere else. But I think nothing shows the problems that we have in the quality of the reporting as much as the case of the 15 medics and how that story was disseminated. I'll ask you to comment on it if you don't mind, but I want to, before I do, I want to caveat this by saying the changes and fluidity of the reporting to it all occurred within the same sort of 36, 48 hour window of when RT launched its Clarity project about how they were fact checking things to avoid misinformation and disinformation. So I find the timing of that to be kind of macabre in its own way. So please, Niall, tell me what you saw when you looked at that particular case, because to me it was heinous.
Yeah. So this was the killing. It would have been in because there was a bit of time before the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA.
Sorry, can I say one thing before you do? If you'd gone back 2 weeks before on the Palcast, Yusuf said it at the beginning of this. Mm-hmm. Now we had thought there was 8 medics killed at the time. That was what he had heard on that afternoon, and news didn't come out for another 10 days, I believe it was.
Yeah, it was in late March that they would have been killed. It was early April then, over a week before OCHA staff could get out there. So yeah, it was 8 medics from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which is part of the wider International Red Cross system. 6 first responders from the civil defense in Gaza, and a UN employee. So they were all killed, found in a mass grave, buried with their crushed ambulances. The siren of one of the ambulances was actually marking or close to where they were buried. So they were discovered by OCHA. I think there was only one survivor. The other crew were obviously killed. They were all in their uniform. The OCHA, or the Red Crescent, found one paramedic with his hands tied behind his back. So that's what you had at that stage. Then obviously bodies were examined. There was evidence then, a forensic doctor who examined them. This is widely reported in The Guardian afterwards and other places. Saw evidence of close range execution style killing. The bullets, he said, were specific and intentional. So that came out a bit after. So up to the point of where they were found, I think there was an article. I used the article, a BBC article, because it got caused a lot of outrage and got a lot of attention online. But their headline was that the Red Cross outraged over killing of 8 medics in Gaza. So that's your headline. No mention of Israel or the IDF. First mention only comes, I think, in about the 4th paragraph. Then I suppose it was changed the next day to say the medics were killed by Israeli forces in the headline and first line. So I think in one point as a journalist you could argue you're waiting for the facts to develop, and as they do, maybe the story could go on. But I mean, it was very obvious what had happened in that case, and if it was a once off, but it's such a repeated trend of gaps in the basic tenets of journalism, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Some of those elements are missing quite often for some reason in headlines and the start of articles, the most important part of news articles. And usually the parts that are missing are who was the perpetrator of the bombing, what potential justification there could ever have been to it, or in cases you've probably seen those articles where it just says Palestinians end up, basically it's the equivalent of Palestinians have been killed or ended up dead by a bomb.
The most recent one was
ended up dead. There's
the most recent one that sticks in my mind was where a doctor's family, somehow their house collapsed on them.
So it's things like that. It's a repeated pattern of things, and I suppose in this case, when the information came out more, and then I suppose the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, had to, obviously, as the attention was growing, coming out and saying that those ambulances didn't have their lights on, their sirens, that they were approaching suspiciously. Then video evidence emerged from the phone of one of the frontline first responders who was killed and put in the grave. Showed clearly that their sirens were on, all marked. I think it was 3 or 4 ambulances, clearly sirens on, all of them wearing the classic high vis of a first responder or an aid worker or emergency worker in those situations. So that refuted very clearly the evidence was there. And, Al Jazeera, other publications who have a very good track record of the reporting on this, obviously carried that, the reality of it. But it was very surprising to see, probably again, wire copy maybe, but in the BBC and also RTE saying that the footage appears to contradict the Israeli account. Or CNN said it cast doubt on Israel's explanation. And I think the one I found most surprising was the New York Times, which, was they came out very strongly that they had what we call in journalism a scoop. They were the first to get the video footage, at least in Western media. They were adamant about what had happened, but a follow-up news article in that same publication, the headline was, Israel says its account of rescue workers killed in Gaza was partly, quote, mistaken. Come on. I mean, how we can have headlines and copy such as this when even within that their own publication was bragging about how they had the video evidence. Now, of course, that was having the video evidence writing the other piece was very important, but then if there's going to be a series of articles that go back to the same type of explanations like that, missing the information or caveating the information, it's just, in my opinion, it's just not good journalism.
I think you've touched on something before we wrap this up, that there has been, there just hasn't been enough Western journalists actually speaking out for their own colleagues on the ground in Gaza. That is categorically true. There was so much more of an outrage when it came to, and they're rightly so, to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis, and that got so much more attention than what has actually taken place to journalists in Gaza. There's somehow their lives matter less to so many. Now I can think of some really honourable journalists who have done great work over the last 18 months as well, and some who've actually stepped up when they, to their detriments maybe, whereby, because I do find, and again I'm not asking Niall to comment on this, but I can think of a couple of examples of journalists who have tried to do work that found themselves all of a sudden on a different beat, within Irish organisations, and that's something else that needs to be looked at. And I'll take heat for this, and I don't care, because obviously, thankfully, we remain completely independent. But Niall mentioned Dropsite News. Their investigation showed that Meta, for example, were taking out 70%, I believe, Niall, of comments that they want that the Israeli authorities wanted removed, whether it be news or comment from other people. We see. We've had Abu Bakr Abed on the podcast, and he wants to be a Premiership football journalist. He wants to talk about sport. And if you ever hear him, folks, and I'm sure you have if you've listened to us, he sounds like he's about to tell you who scored from a header in the 87th minute. But he's now, and I see, unfortunately, his reporting getting undermined. Yet, as Niall points out, he's gone on to report for larger organisations in the US that is, and his voice carries. No one in Ireland wanted to take me up on the offer of talking to him. It's just, it's insane to me. And Niall, I know I sound like go on.
No, I was just going to say he's done, like, some of the stuff he's been writing for Dropsite News is incredible. And he's so, like you said, he wants to be a sports reporter. He can't.
No.
He just can't. And he's so young. And same as Hossam Shabat, same as so many other journalists who have been killed. There are eyes and ears on the ground, and for them to not get the backing of so many reporters, I'll never understand it.
And just on the Hossam Shabat one, we spoke to one of his colleagues, and he was supposed to join us, and at the time this is a little aside, he couldn't get his devices charged in time to join us, and when he did, he sent me this really apologetic, and you'll understand this now because you'll have spoken to people within Palestine. It was almost as if he'd committed a crime against me by not being able to get in touch just in time for the recording session, and I had so much guilt thinking, oh my God, the just what the journalists on the ground in Gaza have gone through to get their stories out and get their voices out, and then for so many editors, producers, not to just simply bat it away. I don't know how you can I don't know how you can sleep at night. And I'm sorry, but anyway, I've rambled into.
But just
sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Just on that note, just when you say about what, like, yeah, because I've spoken to some people in Gaza and obviously West Bank before, and you're always trying to be cognizant if they can't make it on time, potentially other issues, but it comes back to the whole thing about Western reporters consistently reporting on these things from, say, Tel Aviv, occasionally Jerusalem, but very often Tel Aviv. I think it would be an important thing for news organizations to also, if they're going to send someone to Tel Aviv, that the reporters should spend half their time also maybe in Ramallah, to experience something different, to see the difficulties in even just getting there. I've reported from the West Bank twice. It's not a massive experience, but it was enough for me to see what it could be like for a reporter. It was tough enough maybe as a Western reporter in terms of transport arrangements, organization, things like that. It's a much different experience for Palestinian reporters on the ground, and I think it would be a very good thing for more Western reporters to have a little bit of that experience to see, because Tel Aviv is a very, very different experience than the West Bank, and certainly different than Gaza.
I think I know it's not the same, but it is also, you'll hear me out on this, Niall. Rita Fagan, who was trying to deliver social and affordable housing out in Dolphin House, said that too many political correspondents need to spend 3 weeks in Leinster House and 1 week in Dolphin House every month so they could actually understand who they're supposed to be reporting for when they're doing their work. And you've just touched upon that when it comes to the level of, unfortunately, and it began probably long before the Iraq War, but if you remember the process of the embedded journalist, and we see how difficult that's become now and how it's become part and parcel of it. I'm very conscious of time. I'm really grateful first of all, I'm really grateful you wrote the piece. I think it's excellent. I think, as someone who's often said, the greatest living writer is Aaron Dahi Roy, but my favourite dead writer is Chekhov, and Chekhov was all about brevity, Niall. It's not a long read considering the amount of work you put into it, and each paragraph to me almost explains a different area of it and how things have actually gone down, and I really appreciate you doing that. I will end with Document the horrors of northern Gaza. I'm going to have to cut that. We're just going to end with the words of Hassam Shabat, who Niall quotes at the end of the piece. For the past 18 months, I've dedicated every moment of my life to my people. I documented the horrors in northern Gaza minute by minute, determined to show the world the truth they tried to bury. Do not let the world look away. And Niall continues, this is the very least a Western reporter should be doing. And to do it accurately, based on the overwhelming evidence on the ground, it's beyond time to sharpen our pens. Niall Sargent, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for putting your head above the parapet. I doubt you'll get many people thanking you publicly for it, but I think it was really important that someone did it.
Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate that.
Listen, folks, this is as if by serendipity, but in the wrong way. We are going back to speak to a medic in Gaza, but he actually sent me a text earlier, and Niall knows I said to him I'm recording a podcast shortly, but he said I've just been pulled into a surgery. So we're now waiting on him to leave a surgery before he will join us on the podcast, because that is the reality on the ground, and we will continue to try and bring you those voices as often as we can. Thanks again. The link to Niall's piece is at the bottom of the pod, so please give it a read, and do support the guys. Like Niall has done brilliant work, whether it be on climate action, whether it be on environmental issues, whether it be on what's happening in Gaza now. So that is well worth it. Unfortunately, journalism is just not financially viable in the current form. But at least there's people doing good work out there. So thanks again, and we will talk to you all very, very soon. Take care. Bye bye.